Welcome to Metcalf Institute's 25th Annual Public Lecture Series. I'm Sunshine Menezes, Metcalf's Executive Director, and I'm joining you today from the ancestral and current homelands of the Narragansett and Eastern Niantic nations. Their lands and waters originally encompassed what is now the state of Rhode Island into eastern Connecticut and southern Massachusetts, and we pay our respects to elders past and present. The University of Rhode Island's Metcalf Institute has been advancing informed and inclusive public conversations about science and the environment since 1998. We achieve this through science training for professional journalists from around the world, communication training for scientists and engineers, and public events like this one. We also founded the Inclusive SciComm Symposium, which brings together researchers and practitioners from around the world to make all types of science communication more inclusive and equitable. This year's lecture series explores the unique challenges that inland and coastal flooding have created for the physical and social infrastructures that sustain communities. Climate change is causing more frequent and intense precipitation and flooding events around the world, and these massive and sometimes sudden flood events cause catastrophic damage to infrastructure, the loss of homes and livelihoods, and most tragically, the loss of lives. And as we see time and time again, many effects of flooding are felt disproportionately among low-wealth communities and communities of color. This week, through discussions of flooding risks, infrastructure, flood policy and planning, and community action, we've been investigating the far-reaching effects that flooding can have on communities to further understand how to support equitable, community-based solutions to the increasing challenge of major flood events around the world. We want to thank you all for being here today to further explore these critical topics. I also want to note that thanks to our generous advisory board, Metcalf Institute has a dollar-for-dollar matching opportunity this month until June 30th for all donations up to $11,000. Your gifts support public programs like this one, as well as training opportunities, all in the interest of advancing conversations that increase awareness and action on the urgent challenges posed by climate change and environmental inequities more broadly. If you would like your gift automatically doubled, please click on the link that is now in the chat. And now to today's lecture, which is going to take us into a much more personal journey about the effects of flooding. Communities in Houston and its surrounding areas are still dealing with the effects of Hurricane Harvey, even though it's been 5 years in August since that devastating storm. Whether those effects are related to waiting on promised government funding for rebuilding or healing from the emotional trauma, residents of the area and the Gulf Coast have long had to deal with the fallout of disaster as part of their daily realities. Today, we will hear about a terrifically powerful project designed to collect the stories of people whose lives are increasingly punctuated by disaster and to help uncover the collective reality of living in an age of climate crisis. The person guiding us through this emotionally challenging conversation is Dr. Lacey Johnson. Dr. Johnson is an author, activist, professor of creative nonfiction at Rice University, and the founding director of the Houston Flood Museum. Two of Dr. Johnson's recent books were finalists for the National Book Critics Circle Award, and her book, The Reckonings, a collection of essays about social, racial, and environmental justice, was named a Best Book of the Year by the Boston Globe in 2018. Her writing has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, the LA Times, the Paris Review, Orion, and Guernica, among many other outlets. Dr. Johnson's most recent work, to be released next month, is called More City Than Water, a Houston Flood Atlas. This atlas combines personal narratives about Houston's defining floods with striking visuals of floodplains and flood maps of the area, providing a novel way of communicating about and illuminating the changing reality of living with catastrophic flooding. It is now my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Lacey Johnson.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and I'm really so thrilled and pleased to be here. If you'll give me just a moment while I share my screen. So today I want to talk a little bit about some of what I've learned from working on flooding in Houston And a portion of my talk is taken from the introduction to that forthcoming atlas that Sunshine mentioned, the More City Than Water. There's a light pole on my street, a few houses down from mine, where one of my neighbors has painted a rainbow stripe about as high as my chest to mark the high water point reached during Hurricane Harvey in 2017. The paint has chipped a little in the several years since the storm. The houses in our neighborhood have been repaired, the dumpsters filled with moldy sheetrock and furniture, carpet, and ruined family albums have all been hauled away. Hurricane Harvey made landfall on Friday, August 25th, 2017 in Rockport, Texas. Sorry, one second. Push the wrong button. Virtually destroying the entire town before heading northeast along the Gulf Coast. The storm arrived in Southwest Houston. There we go. Early Saturday and stalled over the city for 5 days, dropping as much as 61 inches of rain in some places. At that time, it was the single greatest rainfall event in North America in recorded history. Each of the 11 bayous in the city left its banks and entered the surrounding neighborhoods. But now, almost 5 years later, it is still unclear what percentage of people have lost or had damage to their homes. I've heard a third of people. I've heard over 100,000 homes or 200,000 homes. In some places in the city, some people still haven't even begun the process of reconstruction. Their FEMA claims have been denied. Their applications for a buyout have been denied. They called the disaster hotline for assistance and found no one who spoke their language. In my neighborhood in West Houston, the worst of the flooding arrived when the Army Corps of Engineers decided to open the dams at Barker and Addicks reservoirs to prevent what they were calling, somewhat euphemistically, catastrophic failure and uncontrolled release. Downstream from the dams, a mile from Buffalo Bayou, my family and our neighbors had gone to bed grateful that the storm was finally beginning to move off to the east. But when we woke up in the morning, the bayou had become a river over a mile wide, raging through the streets past our front door. At a press conference, men in official-looking uniforms told those of us who watched the live stream at home that the water would continue to rise, but that no one knew how much. Maybe 1 foot, maybe 3 feet. Outside, the water bubbled up from storm drains, out of sewers, smelled of the rank contagion of human and industrial waste. One neighbor, a surveyor, got out his equipment to see how much more water the street could take before the flooding reached our houses. None of us could take much more. Like thousands of others, my family chose to evacuate, carefully placing all of our furniture on blocks before leaving our home. Helicopters circled overhead and US Coast Guard members rode airboats along the rivers of our streets as we trudged through sewage to the end of the block, where we left the neighborhood and entered a militarized zone. Soldiers helped my elderly neighbors off high water military vehicles, while emergency medical responders administered oxygen and first aid under plastic tents. My family eventually found refuge at our friend's home across town in a neighborhood where a few branches had fallen into yards here and there, but all the streets were dry. Buses were running. Pizza could be delivered to your door. For weeks afterward, many people helped in the ways we knew how, by volunteering our time or labor, by organizing food for the thousands of evacuees, by collecting donations for families and schools in need. I heard dozens of stories of everyday heroism, and these stories, heard and repeated over and over, have become the official stories of the storm. A story of sacrifice and resilience, of working together for the common good. We repeat these stories because we like what they say about us as a community, as people. But these stories aren't complete, and they are only partially true. I also heard the story of a man whose house, built up on a raised foundation above the street level, did not flood at the end of a street where every other house went underwater. The day after the flood receded, When his neighbors were allowed back to their homes, he sat on his porch with a gun over his knee and aimed it at anyone who tried to park in front of his driveway, flaunting his dry privilege, as well as the coldness of his heart. I heard too the story of a single mother in the predominantly African-American neighborhood of Houston Gardens in Northeast Houston, who was living in a tent in her yard because she had been denied assistance by FEMA. She was trying to muck out the house herself to make it livable again before volunteers finally arrived to help. But when a friend's home flooded on the other side of town in Meyerland, which is predominantly affluent and white, her family received help from FEMA and insurance adjusters, and within days, a team of contract laborers were swinging hammers and putting her house and her life back into place. These stories and the inequality they represent also tell us who we are as a community, as people. My proximity to flooding during Harvey has made me think a lot about flooding over the past several years. Though for a long time, I almost never thought about flooding at all. When I moved to Houston in 2004, with the man who was then my boyfriend, who's now my husband, we rented a tiny apartment on the second floor of a duplex in Montrose and shared only one car between us. We didn't have a television at that time and had little access to the news. A few times each June through November, during Houston's annual hurricane and heavy rain season, my mom would call from Missouri to ask whether our house was flooded. Houston is all over the news, she would say, watching footage of flooded underpasses and high water rescues. Our neighborhood was on high ground, I explained. Our street was dry except for a few puddles. I knew that a few blocks from our home, Buffalo Bayou had probably left its banks to fill Eleanor Tinsley Park. Soon it would drain and the flooding would disappear, and I would forget the city had ever flooded at all. This all changed in 2005, when the televisions and restaurants and waiting rooms showed footage of people waving white towels from the roofs of their submerged houses. Hurricane Katrina had struck New Orleans, and the storm surge, which had broken the levees, flooded 80% of the city, killing over 1,800 people and displacing over 1 million from their homes. A quarter of these people found their way to Houston, migrating in buses, in cars, on boats, leaving behind communities, histories, memories, and generations of making a place a home. For the first time, I began to realize that though rain might fall without regard for social or economic disparities, flooding reinforces the inequalities that surround us every day. 2 weeks later, before many of the evacuees had found permanent shelter, Hurricane Rita took aim at Houston, and then Governor Rick Perry ordered an evacuation of the entire metropolitan area. Traffic was gridlocked in some places for 24 hours as the temperature rose to over 100 degrees. Hurricane Rita weakened before turning and making landfall in Louisiana, but not before 118 people had died in their cars on the interstate, casualties of the storm that never came. Suddenly, it seemed flooding was everywhere. The following year, in 2006, when I was pregnant with my first child, one especially heavy June storm dropped over 6 inches of rain in just under 75 minutes. Berry and Sims bayous left their banks and rushed into 3,370 homes, 561 apartments, and 1 nursing home, where over 100 elders had to be evacuated. In 2008, when my child was nearly 2, Hurricane Ike made landfall at Galveston Island, recording a storm surge of 22 feet at Sabine Pass, dropping 20 inches of rain in 2 days. An estimated 100,000 structures flooded. Galveston Island was declared uninhabitable, and power outages left millions in the dark for more than 10 days. The following year, in 2009, spring storms flooded over 2,000 structures, highways closed, 5 children drowned in a car. In 2012, after our second child was born, overflowing creeks flooded dozens of structures. In 2014, the year we bought our home, Greens Bayou left its bank and entered over 100 homes. In 2015, over Memorial Day weekend, entire watersheds filled, damaging more than 6,000 structures and killing 7 people. The following year, in April, 7 more died and nearly 10,000 structures were flooded during the tax day flood. And in 2017, creek and river flooding damaged over 1,000 additional homes at the end of May. 8 major floods in 11 years, not even counting all the unnamed minor flooding that occurs each time we have a good rain. By the time Harvey hit in late 2017, my young family had moved to the far west part of the city. We were excited to find a place only a mile from Buffalo Bayou and to find that the bayou had a park where I could run. We lived there uneventfully for several years, long enough for us to befriend neighbors, to learn that one of them was willing to run in the park with me several times a week, and to understand how the bayou changes throughout the year. The sun comes up behind the bayou's southern bank in the winter and over the northern bank in the summer. The flowers that grow in May and June are different from the ones that grow in January. I learned that I couldn't run in the park even after a few hours of heavy rain, because in the park's lowest places, the bayou leaves its banks and muddies the path. I learned that after an entire day of heavy rain, the bayou fills the low basins of the park, though usually only briefly. I began to see how the hills and valleys that make this park so beautiful and a challenge to run have been carved by flooding during all the bayou's seasons, beginning long before I moved to Houston, when my neighborhood had been undeveloped coastal prairie, and well before that, when the Badai and Akokisa people came to fish and trade along the water's edge. The bayou had a memory of all the time before, of journeying beyond its banks to shape and reshape the place that nearly 7 million people now call home. All water has a perfect memory, Toni Morrison writes, but people tend to forget. Or perhaps we remember quite well, but the memory of water is longer than our own. 2 years after Hurricane Harvey in 2019, Houston flooded again, this time from Tropical Storm Imelda, which dropped 43 inches of rain in 2 days. This flood was the 5th 500-year flood Houston had suffered in 5 years. For the 5th year in a row, we pulled one another from submerged vehicles and flooded homes. This time, a man drowned in his van, another in a pickup, one in a car, another trying to rescue his horse. One man drowned in a ditch. For a short time, the entire town of Winnie, Texas was underwater. Port Arthur was destroyed again. Barges containing toxic chemicals crashed into one another along the Houston Ship Channel again. But the second largest petrochemical complex in the world continued to supply the only nation to have withdrawn from the Paris Climate Accord with enough petroleum and natural gas to cause ice in the Arctic to melt, to cause sea levels to rise, and to cause natural disasters to become more catastrophic here and around the world every single year. Our growing numbness to these events makes us more susceptible to the disaster in the future, not less. Houston is designed to flood, I have heard people say again and again, as they replace more and more of the coastal prairie with streets and interstates and apartment buildings and enormous multi-million-dollar estates. But I do not hear anyone saying what this means when we see that catastrophic flooding does not touch people's lives equally. In the greater Greens Point area, a low-income community situated along Greens Bayou, some homes have flooded more than 10 times since Tropical Storm Allison in 2001. In Independence Heights, the first Black municipality in Texas, homes never flooded until TxDOT built the I-610 interchange. On the east side, near the Ship Channel, residents deal not only with chronic catastrophic flooding from rain and storm surges, but also with the flooding of toxins, and not only when it rains. In contrast, the wealthiest neighborhoods, especially those located in the city center, River Oaks, Montrose, and West University, almost never flood at all. This is a story that needs telling, even if the official one resists change. In this city, buildings go up, buildings come down. 100,000 people move here every year, cramming into tiny apartments or 3-bedroom homes in suburbs or tents along the bayou or vast sprawling estates. Refineries churn thousands of tons of toxic chemicals into the air every year, and gardens bloom here every day. An ideal map of the city should include, marked in different inks, this history and all its implications, articulated and silent, evident and hidden. Just after Hurricane Harvey, at least partially in response to our city's persistent collective numbness and amnesia about catastrophic flooding, I began working to bring together a massive team of people to launch a new project called the Houston Flood Museum. This is a project that's meant to discover and collect these histories, as many as we can, about this storm and all the others, about flooding, about the flooding to which this city is exceptionally prone, and to think in a critical way about the city and its heroes and its flaws. For me, this is the broad purpose of telling any story, to make sense of that which is nonsense, to make order from chaos, to make meaning from the messiness and joy and occasional disaster that is life. I spent the year between Hurricane Harvey and its first anniversary, which was when we launched the Houston Flood Museum, collecting those stories. And after a few months, it became clear that I was only getting two kinds. One kind was that I had seen flooding. Someone had seen flooding. It didn't happen to me personally, but I felt really bad about it. It's upsetting to see, and I really wish we could do something about it. And the second type was from people who had themselves flooded, but they had flood insurance and were in the process of recovery. And they wanted, really rightfully, to document that trauma of being flooded. I know from having written about trauma in my own life that the work of narrativizing can help fold the terrible things that have happened to us back into the fabric of who we are, so that it becomes not something that happened to you, but a part of who you are. And that is an essential part of the healing process. But I also knew from the reporting and organizing work that I was doing that these were not the only kinds of experiences that people were having after the storm. I knew that there were many people who had not gotten the resources they needed to muck out weeks or months later, that there were people who were denied assistance because their homes had been inherited and heirship properties were not being recognized as legitimate, or because they would call the hotline and find no one who spoke their language. And of course, we weren't getting any stories like that at the museum because these folks did not have the privilege of being able to sit down and document it. So one of the first pivots that we made after the launch of the museum was to begin a series of projects around that question of why is this experience of flooding so disparate? Why are some people getting multiple rounds of assistance from insurance, from FEMA, and others can't even get the resources they need to gut the moldy sheetrock from their homes? What is happening here and what's with that? So More City Than Water is one of the projects that emerged from this line of questioning. It's an atlas that combines essays and conversations about flooding with artfully rendered maps designed by the by the University of Houston's graphic design program's graduating class of 2019. With generous funding from the Houston Endowment and the Humanities Research Center at Rice University, we began working on this project in 2018, just after the launch of the museum in August. And we started by asking writers from many different disciplines and backgrounds and kinds of experiences to share their thoughts about what is revealed or obscured by catastrophic flooding. My actual question to them went, what does catastrophic flooding reveal and what does it obscure? The responses moved along a spectrum from intimate and personal forms of reckoning to more public and analytical forms. These are a few of the maps that have been designed to accompany the essays. From Ice to Inundation, for example, Rice anthropology professor Simini Howe considered what new satellite modeling reveals about the relationship of melting ice in the Arctic to sea level rise in the Gulf of Mexico. In Higher Ground, Brian Washington described the chaos and confusion of the early days after the storm and the many obstacles people face while trying to attend to the needs of their communities. In Community Power, Ben Hirsch wrote about the birth of West Street Recovery, an organization dedicated to providing recovery assistance to people who had been excluded from the broader recovery effort. In Gusher, Houston native Sonia Hamer wrote about the history of oil discovery and its relationship to enduring wealth inequality and environmental racism. And in Ombrophobia, my co-editor Cheryl Beckett offered a visual essay about her uneasy intimacy with hurricanes. What emerged as the atlas took shape was a vision, which was always loving, but often critical, of who and where we are. I had noticed that there was more to say about policy, infrastructure, and climate change than there was space to say it within the discourse on these subjects. It occurred to me that more honesty and candor about our collective history might help us learn from it, to mourn what we've lost, and with any luck, we might find inspiration about how we might move together into the future. And in the course of working on that project and our continuing work on the other exhibits within the Houston Flood Museum, I have learned a handful of things, and so I'm going to share those with you. So my first lesson is that flooding isn't new. So I came across, early on in the process, I came across an infographic produced by the Harris County Flood Control District, which is seen here, that showed that Houston has suffered at least 3 major catastrophic floods every decade since its founding. And this particular version of the timeline only goes back to 1900, but I believe there's a different version that went back to 1836, which is when Houston was founded, by the Allen brothers, who sent out advertisements about their new settlement in postcards sent back to the East Coast, which showed a picturesque landscape with mountains and waterfalls. This looks a little more like a European hamlet, mountain hamlet, than it does like very flat Houston. But the goal was to get people to move from the East Coast, to sort of lure them in and to settle here in Houston. Quote, "There is no place in Texas more healthy, having an abundance of excellent spring water and enjoying the sea breezes in all its freshness," the ad boasted. "It is handsome and beautifully elevated, salubrious and well watered, and now in the very heart or center of population." In reality, the city was built only after the population began to arrive, and the water supply came from the slow-moving bayou. Swarms of mosquitoes carried yellow fever, causing thousands of deaths in the years ahead. 13 months after the city was founded, in September of 1837, rains from a hurricane flooded the city's main street to a depth of 4 feet. A year later, one of the Allen brothers, one of the founders of Houston, died of malaria. There were at least 15 more major floods in the next 100 years. And as more and more people moved to the city, the floods became more and more severe. One flood in 1929 was particularly catastrophic. Over Memorial Day weekend, a foot of rain fell, inundating the bayous and tributaries, sweeping houses downstream, covering nearly every bridge in town, and rendering the city water supply useless. 1 million acres of agricultural fields were inundated. 6 years later, in 1935, in December, a 2-day downpour caused massive flooding of Buffalo and White Oak bayous. 8 people died, and the ship channel was clogged with mud and debris, submerging docks, causing it to be shut down for 8 months. 25 blocks of downtown were underwater, as were 100 residential blocks. The damage and loss of life caused by this flood resulted in the creation of the Harris County Flood Control District and the subsequent construction of Addicks and Barker reservoirs. At that time, their location was in the far west of the extreme outer reaches of the city. The reservoirs were completed in 1942 and 1948. And while this has undoubtedly mitigated flooding, it hasn't stopped it, certainly not along the other bayous. In 1950s, after the reservoirs were constructed, flooding got so bad that the Army Corps of Engineers decided to straighten and channelize the bayous and encase portions of several of them in concrete. Brays, White Oak, Greens, nearly all of the 11 bayous have been altered in some way. There are a few so-called wild portions left. And in this photo, you see the White Oak Bayou on the left, or excuse me, before channelization and being encased in concrete on the left, and after being channelized and encased on the right. One portion of Buffalo Bayou has been left mostly alone. It's the part that runs between Memorial Park and downtown through some of the city's wealthiest neighborhoods. The residents in those areas had seen what had happened to White Oak Bayou and Brays Bayou, which were both straightened and concretized. And they didn't want that to happen in their own backyards. It's the very definition of a NIMBY project, right? So a young congressman named George H.W. Bush and a young oil man named George Mitchell fought against the channelization and won. And as a result, Buffalo Bayou, at least that section, is one of the few so-called wild rivers left in the Houston area. A recent study in the Journal of Flood Risk Management concluded that Buffalo Bayou, the wild river, fared better than Brays Bayou, which has been channelized and concretized, remember. They concluded that the channelization had increased the water velocity, but that the concretizing also decreased permeability. The water moved, but it has no chance to absorb. Additionally, the wild river has an area around the river that's not allowed to be developed. And at Brays Bayou, you can build right up to the edge. And I think the lesson from all of this is that we've spent 170 years trying to control the river when the river has only ever been doing what a river does. And perhaps we really just need to get out of its way. Lesson 2, flooding isn't an accident. The word bayou is French, which is likely a Gaelicized version of the Choctaw word bayou, which means slow river. Bayous are a common geographic feature in the Gulf coastal plain. Bayou country stretches from Texas all the way to Florida. And bayous are how the water moves through the wetlands when the storms that often blow in from the Gulf make them even wetter. Houston was founded on land that had once been a combination of wetlands and coastal prairie. One function of these two kinds of ecosystems is to act like a sponge. The soil in Houston is dense, dark clay, which is highly impervious to water. But the prairie grass, which grows here in the sort of natural ecosystem, opens up the structure of soils like these and makes them more pervious. But the past 80 years, developers have paved over those clay soils and made the ground increasingly impenetrable. To talk about flooding in these kinds of ecosystems is somewhat disingenuous. It isn't a flood when a wetland fills with water. It becomes flooding because of the ways we live in this place, where the bayous aren't seen as having any claim to the land of their own. They are meant to be brought under human control. The infrastructure projects like the concretizing and channeling of the bayous, and even the construction of the reservoirs are part of that effort. And meanwhile, the city has continued to grow. This slide here shows Houston proper, the growth of Houston proper. So at the time of those infrastructure projects, when they were building the Addicks and Barker reservoirs, which are outside that circle. So there's the green circle, and then there's another loop of highways. So they're outside of that. And so this shows Houston proper. At that time, the city covered 74 square miles and had a population of 384,000. Now it covers an area, and Houston proper is in the slide on the right. It covers an area of over 10,000 square miles and is home to over 7 million people. And all of this sprawl is not represented even in that slide there. That's just Houston proper. In the 10 years between 1997 and 2016 alone, we added 386 square miles of impervious surfaces, such as concrete, to the metro area, and decreased the size of wetlands by 25,000 acres. Those wetlands alone could have absorbed as much as 4 billion gallons of water, which would not have prevented flooding during Harvey, which unleashed more than 9 trillion gallons of water. But it certainly could have mitigated the effects of some of our other flood events. As a result of all these changes to the landscape, in the 21st century alone, let me remind you, there have been at least 11 major catastrophic floods in Houston. In 2016, the year before Hurricane Harvey, the tax day flood inundated nearly 10,000 structures. After Harvey itself inundated nearly 200,000 structures. And a year later, Houston and the surrounding region flooded again during Tropical Storm Imelda, which flooded 4,000 structures. And then again during Tropical Depression Beta, which left large swaths of the city underwater. Development continues more or less unchecked today. Some people seem to think more infrastructure will save us from future storms, more channelizing the bayous, larger drain pipes, and possibly a third reservoir. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, in the Houston Ship Channel, a handful of corporations continue to expand their investment in fossil fuels, lobbying local, state, and federal government agencies to ease environmental restrictions and regulations without regard for the harm they are doing to the people those laws and regulations are designed to protect. Shout out to our interpreter, you're doing such a great job. Thank you so much. Lesson 3, flooding isn't neutral. We think about flooding, or at least I think lay people think about flooding. I tended to think about flooding this way before I started thinking about it more critically. As you know, rain falls from the sky, it pools, it gets everywhere, it moves around from one neighborhood to another. But the history of flooding in this city is not neutral. It's mapped onto other kinds of inequality. The neighborhoods that most frequently flood and have the least support in terms of recovery or disaster planning are those that are the lowest income, that are the most vulnerable in other kinds of ways. In this way, flooding is linked to the history of redlining, of segregation, of gentrification, of environmental racism, and sacrifice zones. I mentioned earlier that there are neighborhoods that have flooded 10 times since Tropical Storm Allison in 2001, and that the wealthiest neighborhoods almost never flood. And as I've been doing this work, I keep coming up against a question, which is, do these neighborhoods not flood because the property has value? Or does the property have value because it does not flood? Either way, wealth means that people have the privilege to live in places where it does not flood. And poverty means people can't afford to live where it doesn't. So it's a matter of where people can afford to live, what neighborhoods end up having value and value enough to be protected. When I see disparities like this, I think I end up asking why one neighborhood has benefited from flood control projects and another has not. One reason is because of the cost-benefit methodology used by the US Army Corps of Engineers when evaluating whether or not to pursue a flood control project. In particular, the US Army Corps of Engineers has to comply with federal policy for project evaluation dating back to the Flood Control Act of 1936. This act states that the federal government should improve or participate in the improvement of navigable waters or their tributaries, including watersheds thereof, for flood control purposes, and this emphasis is mine, if the benefits to whomsoever they may accrue are in excess of the estimated costs. In other words, the value for completing the project has to exceed the cost of undertaking it. One of my colleagues at Rice University, Jim Blackburn, has done a lot of work on how this has disproportionately benefited wealthy communities and disproportionately penalized lower income communities. In wealthy communities, high home values almost always exceed the cost of a given project. And in lower income communities, relatively low home values make it difficult to adhere to this cost benefit standard, even when more homes might be protected in the lower income area than in the wealthy area for the same or even a lower cost. The result over time is this catastrophic inequality that we're seeing today. And I see an example of this, even since Hurricane Harvey. In the past several years, there's been a massive drainage infrastructure project happening out near where I live, where there are these huge drainage systems being installed underneath the streets and underneath the ground, so that when the bayou starts to come out of its banks, it's essentially sucked into these pipes and moved toward the bayou and toward the bay. Millions and millions of dollars being spent on these kinds of infrastructure projects. But and I live in, full disclosure, I live in a fairly affluent neighborhood. But in sort of Northeast Houston and lower income communities, they haven't had any kind of infrastructure projects for over 30 years. And the drainage systems that they rely on are ditches between their houses and the road. But of course, these aren't the only kinds of inequalities that we have in Houston, and that it doesn't only take the form of flooding. Near the Houston Ship Channel, which again is a massive industrial corridor of refineries, chemical plants, storage tanks, and pipeline terminals that form the second largest petrochemical complex in the world. Hurricane Harvey meant communities were exposed not only to street flooding and drainage problems, but also to harmful carcinogens when refineries, seeing that flooding was imminent, illegally burned off hundreds of thousands of pounds of toxic chemicals to prevent damage to their equipment. Because of lax regulations and enforcement, these illegal emissions didn't amount to crimes, even if they're tantamount to poisoning. But flooding and exposure to these emissions is a symptom of vulnerability. It's not its cause. And we see other disastrous symptoms of what makes us vulnerable every day. Two tankers collide and oil sheen spreads across the surface of Galveston Bay. A chemical storage tank near the ship channel burns uncontrollably for days and days, sending a plume of black smoke over the entire city and beyond, extending halfway across the state, visible from space. A highway is built and severs a historic African-American community in two. The flooding it causes is part of a violence that isn't new. What makes people more or less vulnerable to this violence is structural. A relationship we have been told is inevitable and necessary to protect the comfort of those who are already living comfortably. It's part of a history of decisions about the land and who deserves to live on it, but also of prioritizing prosperity at the expense of people's health and safety, or sometimes at the expense of entire ecosystems. When the next flood or freeze or pandemic or hurricane hits us, and it certainly will, vulnerability is what will determine who gets to live and who will die and how. The flood doesn't come only from the weather. It is the shape of the wound structural violence has already made. So those are my 3 lessons. And they're not the only things I've learned, of course, but I know that I'm very short on time. So I want to leave you with just one last thought. So as I mentioned at the very beginning, all of this sort of came from collecting stories and thinking about the stories of Houstonians and our community members. And in the process of collecting those stories, I have learned that being flooded is, more than anything else, a trauma for the people who wake up with water in their homes, from whom the flood takes everything they have ever owned. And I know from having spent most of my career writing and thinking about these issues that this loss is not only physical, because the disaster makes fragments of time and language and ourselves. And once the whole is broken into pieces, it feels almost impossible to put them back. But I also know that there is a role that stories can play here, because narrativizing these disasters transforms them from something that happened to you and turns it into a part of who you are. And that telling the story of what you have survived transforms your survival into a form of expertise. Survivors are experts in their own experience, and there is so much that they can teach us. We would do well to learn from them if we have any hope of surviving the disasters of the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Lacey. Wow, that was a really powerful walk through these experiences, and I just want to thank you for sharing them with us. I want to start with a question about the difficulty of reliving this sort of trauma. And I mean, you said very explicitly a couple of times that this narrativizing is a way of working through the trauma. I wonder how, when in the course of working with authors in your atlas or interviewing people for these various projects, how do they respond to this opportunity to kind of no holds barred share their experiences?
I think a lot of people, well, some people are grateful for it, are grateful for the opportunity to, think about what has happened to them. And one of the essays, or one of the pieces in the atlas, rather, is a poem by this writer, Sonia Del Hierro, who moved to Houston for graduate school in August of 2017. And like a week later, her apartment flooded and everything she had ever owned, all of her books, everything was gone. And she wasn't here during the flood. She sort of fled to Austin to wait out the storm, and came back to find everything destroyed. And I think it's telling that her piece is a poem, because poetry to me is one of the languages of trauma, that it allows, the sort of blank spaces and gaps and holes that poetry permits, is an excellent way of sort of communicating the failure of language to account for these losses, right? Or the sort of emotional experience that in some ways, those white spaces are, they communicate more than words can. But there were other people who had flooded who just did not, as I talked about early, they just were not in a place in their like material recovery to sit down and document their experiences. And so I think, there's certainly like a kind of hierarchy that, of needs that need to be met before people can sort of take the time to document it. I want to say one more thing about that, which is, as we started realizing that we were getting these two kinds of stories, right, that didn't include these other kinds of losses, at the Houston Flood Museum, we sort of pivoted some of our work so that we weren't just collecting stories. We began to send writers out to do these sort of trauma writing workshops in different neighborhoods and in different communities, at the city jail, the county jail, the retirement community, some of these communities that have had repeated losses. And those, like, the goal was not to extract those stories and to house them in the museum, but just to sort of provide the service of being able to sort of, give people an opportunity to sort of like tell their story. And I think that, that was one of the most important things that we were able to do.
Thanks. There's a question that came in that is very similar to the one I just asked, but adds just a little bit more. So while we're on this topic, they had asked, did you manage to reach the people who you couldn't get at first? And so you've just answered that to some degree. And then they go on, if so, how did you address the barriers they were facing to having their stories heard and build trust that you would be a responsible keeper of their stories?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, part of that was that we weren't keeping them. We didn't take them. We didn't, like if people wanted to later submit them to us, we would certainly, host them on the website or be responsible stewards. But to me, the point was not to collect them and to extract them, that the trust was built by giving, just sort of facilitating the stories and letting them live in the communities. One of the projects that we have since worked on is a project called Project Pleasantville. And that's something that my former colleague, Zoe Wool, and several community members, Bridget Murray and Cleophas Sharp in Pleasantville community have founded to document a neighborhood history, that flooding is part of that history, but it's not only part of that history. And they were, equal stakeholders, in fact, more heavily weighted stakeholders in terms of what they wanted that project to be. Originally, we were just planning to document flooding from Harvey, and there was a dredge, sort of some of the material that had been dredged from the bayou had been stored in a kind of levee in the community. It broke and it flooded the neighborhood. And so they had had several floods, and we were originally interested in just documenting that. But then the community members, they said, look, we want to tell the story of our community, how it was beautiful. We want to sort of tell the story of our political activism and civic engagement. And so then the project began to include all of that, as well as the timeline of the overall neighborhood, just sort of letting community members help to shape the story and the project on their own terms as being, again, equal stakeholders.
Got it. Thank you. So on the topic of communication, but taking a different tack now, another person asked, in all of your conversations with folks in collecting stories or listening to stories or whatever it was, whichever part of this, did you come to any conclusions about the public understanding of flood risk and how governments could best convey risks and frequencies of certain flood events?
My sense is most people have no sense of the risk because there are, especially for renters, there's no law that requires landlords to disclose to renters whether or not their property is prone to flooding. I think there was maybe a bill in the legislature that was intended to correct that, but I don't think that it passed. And I'm not actually sure about that. I would have to double check. But for even homeowners, they don't have to disclose whether a property flooded until closing. So you are right at the moment of getting ready to sign the papers, and you don't find out until then whether or not the property has flooded. And the floodplain is not static and it's not current, right? It's where the 100-year floodplain and the 500-year floodplain are based on past events, not on the present and not on the future, right? Not on potentially more catastrophic storms even than Harvey. But also, as I was sort of talking about, like the way that flooding is dynamic in relationship to development and impervious surfaces, the, paving over the coastal prairie, like the floodplain is changing all the time, every day. And I think in general, people don't have a sense of that, though people who have flooded repeatedly absolutely do. Like they do have a sense of what their risk is and, the kind of calculation of whether to move or not to move or to accept the buyout is a complicated one, because you're not just leaving a home, you're leaving a history, a community. Perhaps, you know, your family has owned this home for generations, and it's hard to just walk away from that.
Right. Well, our final question comes from Brian, and it's a big one. So yes, is resilience to flooding a fallacy? Should we be focusing on something else?
You know, I don't know if it's just resilience to flooding that's a fallacy. I struggle a little bit. I kind of prickle, or have a little staticky relationship with the concept of resilience, because especially, you know, coming as I do from a sort of you know, a background of thinking about interpersonal violence, right? And resilience is a, you know, buzzword in that circle as well. And because resilience places all the burden of bouncing back on the people who've been harmed, and none of the burden of preventing a catastrophe, or, you know, the violence of disaster from occurring in the first place. You know, like there's a project right now, the sort of ongoing discussion is whether we should build a, you know, the Ike, what's called the Ike Dike, a coastal spine, just sort of outside the sort of bay, the Galveston Bay, to prevent storm surge from coming into the bay and you know, creating a kind of environmental disaster with all the refineries at the ship channel and everything like that. So it's you know, and to me, the problem with that discussion is that if we are thinking of literally remaking the coast or remaking the world, rather than asking, you know, these fossil fuel companies to stop creating such toxic chemicals right next to the banks of the bayou, right? That it just sort of places the burden, you know, that sort of question of resiliency pushes the burden onto the wrong people. Like, perhaps rather than, I mean, I think absolutely we should do everything that we can to sort of make sure that people recover after times of disaster. But we should also be thinking about what we can be changing about our behaviors, the way we live in these places, that makes it more possible to coexist with them and to sort of live more gently with the land and the ecosystems, more naturally with the ecosystems that we inhabit.
Thank you. I am so grateful for you, Lacey, for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us today, and also to all of you. Thanks for joining us again today. As a reminder, you can still register for the rest of this week's lectures by visiting the link that Margaret has just shared in the chat. And don't forget that you can see all of the recordings for the lectures this week by visiting our YouTube channel. That link is also in the chat. And if you're inspired by these talks and want to support more of Metcalf Institute's work to have conversations about these really major environmental challenges and solutions, we hope you'll make a gift today and get the extra thrill of knowing that your gift will be matched. So please, at this point, join us for tomorrow's Leeson lecture to hear from Laura Lightbody, who directs the Flood Prepared Communities Initiative at the Pew Charitable Trusts. She will discuss promising innovations in state and federal government to mitigate the risks of major flooding events through policy actions. I want to note that tomorrow's lecture will be taking place at a different time than the rest of our scheduled talks this week. It will be at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Until then, thank you for your attention, and we look forward to seeing you again. Take care.